A corrupt cop is having a typical day of throwing his weight around, harassing a woman he assumes is just another easy target. He mocks her, demands unnecessary identification, and belittles her without any reason. But when the woman calmly reveals her true identity, everything changes in an instant. The cop freezes. He has no idea who he's really dealing with. What happens next will leave you speechless and make you rethink the power dynamics between authority figures and everyday people. Stay tuned for this shocking twist that proves no one is above the law. It was just another typical day on the streets of the city. People hustled and bustled, going about their business in the busy downtown area. Cars whizzed by, the sidewalks were crowded with pedestrians, and the sound of city life filled the air. But for the woman walking down the sidewalk, this was no ordinary day. She was heading to an important meeting with a calm demeanor, dressed in a simple outfit, jeans, a jacket, and sunglasses. But there was something about her that radiated confidence and self-assurance. She had worked hard to get where she was, and though she didn't feel the need to announce it to the world, her quiet presence commanded respect. She had a purpose, and as she walked with a steady pace, it seemed like nothing could interrupt her flow until a figure stepped in her way. Standing by the street corner, a corrupt police officer watched her approach. He was a middle-aged man, in his late 40s, with a face hardened by years of abusing his power. His uniform was slightly askew, his posture too rigid to be comfortable. He had a reputation around town for using his badge to intimidate people, especially those he assumed were weaker than him. It wasn't the first time he'd flexed his authority unnecessarily. The officer, who was always quick to judge people based on his own biases, sized her up the moment she walked into his line of sight. Without reason or provocation, he stepped toward her, blocking her path. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice condescending and authoritative. "Can I see some identification?" The woman looked at him, slightly confused but keeping her composure. "Why would you need to see my ID? I'm just walking down the street," she responded politely. The officer's eyes narrowed. He was used to people being intimidated, people who would comply without question. But this woman, she didn't seem afraid. She seemed unbothered by his presence, and that only made him more irritated. "Just want to make sure you're not causing any trouble, miss. You know the rules," he sneered, assuming she was just another person who would cower under his authority. The woman's calmness only frustrated him more. He could feel his power slipping away, but he refused to back down. His arrogance led him to escalate the situation. The officer's irritation began to grow as the woman didn't immediately cower or apologize. He could feel the tension mounting in the air as his authority was being questioned. To him, this was just another day, another person to push around. But this time, the woman wasn't backing down. "I'm sorry, but I really don't understand why you're stopping me," she said, her voice steady, almost too calm for someone who had just been approached by an aggressive cop. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm just on my way to work." The officer scoffed, his patience wearing thin. "Look, I don't need your excuses," he snapped. "Just show me your ID and we can end this right here." His tone was harsh, meant to make her feel small, to make her comply without question. But the woman wasn't backing down. She stood her ground, her arms crossed, and looked him directly in the eye. "I've done nothing wrong," she repeated, "and I don't owe you anything. If you don't have a reason to stop me, I'll just keep walking." The officer's eyes flicked over her as if scanning her for weaknesses. He hated being challenged, and he could feel his authority slipping further. People on the street began to notice the interaction, some pausing to watch the escalating confrontation, others whispering to one another. The cop's aggressive behavior was beginning to draw attention, and that only made him angrier. "You think you can just walk around here without any consequences?" The officer sneered. "I'll make sure people like you understand the consequences of not following orders." The woman remained calm, but firm. "I'm not doing anything illegal. You have no right to treat me this way." She took a step back, but the officer stepped forward, blocking her path once again. "Oh, I have every right to stop whoever I want, whenever I want. That's the privilege of wearing this badge," he said, lifting his chin, trying to assert dominance. He was used to getting away with this, intimidating people who couldn't fight back, especially those he perceived as weaker or unfamiliar with their rights. The woman's calm demeanor began to rattle the officer even more. He was used to seeing fear in people's eyes, or at least hearing them grovel, but this woman wasn't afraid. In fact, she seemed almost amused by him. His frustration was mounting with each passing second. "I'm asking you one last time," the officer said, his voice a bit more forceful now. "Show me your ID, or I'll have to take further action." It was then that the woman paused. She took a deep breath, and in that moment, the tension seemed to crack open. She wasn't afraid, but she knew it was time to put an end to this harassment. Her next words would change everything. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. She handed it to the officer with an air of finality. The officer, still scowling, glanced down at the card in his hand, not realizing the weight of what was coming. "Take a good look," she said, her voice steady, as if she were in complete control now. "And tell me if you still think you have the right to question me." The officer raised an eyebrow, looking down at the card, which bore a name and title. His eyes scanned it for a moment, still not fully understanding the significance. But then it hit him. His face flushed as he read the words. The title on the card said it all. She wasn't just some random woman. She wasn't someone he could continue to bully. She was an important figure, someone whose name carried weight far beyond his position. The card identified her as a high-ranking official, perhaps even someone in a position to oversee his conduct, his department, and his actions. She was a person of authority in her own right, someone who, until this moment, he had severely underestimated. His arrogance turned to horror in an instant. For a long, tense moment he said nothing, his mind racing to process the situation. The people around them noticed the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders slumped, the way his earlier aggression seemed to vanish. The officer's eyes widened as the reality of the situation sank in. His smug, condescending expression faded into one of disbelief, replaced by the unmistakable look of someone caught off guard. The card in his hand now seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, and as he stared at it, he realized who he had been harassing. The woman standing before him was not just another citizen. She was someone far more important than he had ever imagined. For a moment, the world around him seemed to slow. His mind raced as he recalled all the sharp words, the bullying tone he had used with her, and the way he had assumed he could push her around without consequence. Now, the situation had flipped entirely. He wasn't the one in control anymore. His every move was being judged, not by just this woman, but by the community that had begun to gather around them. The woman, still calm and composed, watched the officer's stunned reaction. She didn't need to say anything more. The impact of her identity was already sinking in. She was someone whose name held weight, someone who could hold him accountable for his actions. She had the power to make sure this incident didn't go unnoticed. The officer's voice cracked as he finally found words. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, a deep flush creeping across his face. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to—" The woman held up her hand, cutting him off. "You didn't mean to," she said, her voice measured but with an underlying steel. "You didn't mean to make assumptions. You didn't mean to use your power to intimidate someone who you had no idea about. You didn't mean to treat me like I'm beneath you." The officer faltered. He couldn't defend his actions. His apology sounded hollow, weak. He had underestimated this woman, and now he had to face the consequences. The crowd around them, which had been quietly observing the interaction, began murmuring. Some of them were shaking their heads in disbelief, while others watched, waiting for the next move. The woman's calm authority stood in stark contrast to the officer's crumbling arrogance. She didn't need to raise her voice or become combative. She was speaking the truth, and it was enough to make the officer's behavior seem not just inappropriate, but shameful. "Do you think you're the only one who wears a badge?" she continued, her tone firm. "Do you think that because you wear that uniform, you have the right to treat people any way you want?" The officer stood there, silent, staring at the ground, unable to look her in the eye. He had been the one to intimidate. And now the tables had turned. He had overstepped, abused his power, and now the consequences were unfolding before him. "Do you realize the position you're putting me in?" the woman added, her voice now a little softer, but no less powerful. "You don't get to make someone feel less than simply because you have the authority to do so. You don't get to make assumptions about people, especially not me." The crowd began to gather more closely around them. The energy in the air had shifted from uneasy tension to quiet support. They had witnessed the officer's bullying behavior, and now they were witnessing his fall from power as he realized just how wrong he had been. The woman's composure in the face of his aggression had left a lasting impression. She wasn't yelling or threatening him. She was calmly asserting her right to be treated with respect. For the first time, the officer's defensiveness began to crumble. He finally looked up at the woman, his face red with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I didn't realize." His voice was barely a whisper now. "You didn't realize," she repeated, incredulously. "What exactly didn't you realize? That you were treating me as if I were beneath you. That you were using your position to abuse your power and push people around." The officer didn't know how to answer. His posture had completely changed. His chest no longer puffed with authority, but hunched in defeat. He had been caught. He had let his biases show, and now there was no easy way out of it. "Do you know how many people face this kind of treatment every single day?" she asked, her voice still calm but cutting. "Do you know how many people, simply because of how they look, are judged, humiliated, and disrespected by people like you who think they have the right to make assumptions?" The officer didn't speak. He had no words left, no excuse, no defense. The truth was out there, and it was undeniable. The woman wasn't just an ordinary person. She wasn't just some random target for his power trip. She was someone who had the authority to hold him accountable for his actions, and she was making sure that he knew it. As the crowd continued to watch, the woman turned away, signaling the end of the confrontation. "I'm done here," she said simply, her voice steady. "But you're not. You need to think about what just happened here and what it means." The officer stood frozen in place, his face still flushed, his mind reeling. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions and realized just how easily they could have cost him everything. His pride, his career, and his authority had all been shaken in an instant by a simple act of truth and courage. As the woman walked away from the stunned officer, the crowd that had gathered around them remained silent for a moment, almost as if they were waiting for something else to happen. The officer, who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, was now left standing in the middle of the street, utterly humiliated. His arrogance had been shattered, and there was no hiding from the truth. The woman had not only exposed his bias, but had also shown everyone present the power of standing up to authority when it's being misused. The officer stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the ground, still processing what had just happened. He had been caught in his own web of assumptions, and the reality of how wrong he had been was sinking in. His once confident posture was now slumped, his face flushed with embarrassment. There was no excuse for his behavior. He had acted impulsively, based on nothing more than stereotypes and the belief that his badge made him untouchable. In the background, the murmurs of the crowd began to grow. Some people started taking out their phones, capturing the moment. It wasn't just the officer who had been caught off guard. It was everyone around them. They had witnessed firsthand how quickly the balance of power could shift when truth was revealed, and the officer's inability to handle the situation made his behavior even more glaring. The woman, now walking away with grace and poise, wasn't done with the situation just yet. She knew that exposing the officer's behavior wasn't enough. It was important to make sure that this incident wasn't brushed aside, that it didn't just become another example of injustice that went unaddressed. She understood that her power didn't come from just standing up to him in that moment. It came from what happened next. As the woman continued down the street, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. The call didn't take long, but when she hung up, she knew that she had set the wheels of accountability into motion. By the time the officer returned to his patrol car, trying to regain some semblance of his earlier confidence, he was met by a higher-ranking officer who had arrived on the scene. It didn't take long for the officer to realize that this wasn't just another person he had brushed off. It was someone whose position in the community was far more significant than his own. The call the woman had made was to the police department itself, and now the officer was under scrutiny from those higher up. His earlier arrogance and dismissiveness had been witnessed by multiple bystanders, and now the higher-ups were demanding answers. The officer's face drained of color as the realization hit him. This wasn't just going to disappear. His conduct had been witnessed, and his actions would have consequences far beyond this moment. Within hours, the story of the altercation was spreading across social media. People who had been on the street that day began sharing what they had seen, and soon the officer's actions were under public scrutiny. Videos and photos of the interaction were circulated, and people from all over began expressing their outrage at how the officer had treated the woman. The online outrage grew quickly, and what had been a simple act of public humiliation for one officer had turned into a widespread conversation about abuse of power and racial bias. The officer, now facing an internal investigation, was suspended from his duties while the department reviewed his conduct. The pressure from the public, along with the damning footage, made it impossible for the department to ignore. The woman, though not seeking personal revenge, had successfully brought attention to the abuse of power and had ensured that the officer would face consequences for his actions. But the true victory wasn't just in the officer's suspension. It was in the message that was sent that no one, regardless of their position, was beyond accountability. The woman's calm and dignified response to the officer's aggression had turned the tables. She hadn't needed to escalate the situation. She had simply stood firm in the face of injustice, and in doing so, she had exposed the officer's wrongdoing. The fallout from the incident wasn't just limited to the officer. The department, too, found itself under the microscope. This incident became a catalyst for further discussions about police reform and how officers are trained to interact with the public. The public outcry wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. In the weeks that followed, The woman's story was shared widely in the media. She was interviewed by various outlets, not to gloat over her victory, but to discuss the larger issue at hand: abuse of power, systemic bias, and the need for better accountability within law enforcement. Her words were powerful, but it wasn't just her testimony that made an impact. It was her actions, her quiet strength, and her ability to turn an unjust situation into an opportunity for change. For the officer, the damage was done. His career would likely never recover from the public exposure of his behavior, and the shame of having been so publicly humiliated would follow him for years to come. The real lesson, however, was in how quickly things had unraveled for him when someone decided not to back down. The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through the community and beyond. The story of the officer's behavior, his eventual downfall, and the woman's poised handling of the situation became a turning point in conversations about law enforcement and systemic issues. What had started as an isolated incident quickly snowballed into a broader discussion about how authority figures often abuse their power, how they treat those they deem inferior, and how easily these situations can go unchecked. It was a stark reminder that, even in seemingly minor encounters, the consequences of prejudice and abuse could be profound. As the days passed, the media buzzed with reports on the incident. The woman, who had been the target of the officer's unjust aggression, had been hailed as a hero, but she remained humble. In interviews, she made it clear that she wasn't looking for recognition. Her goal was to shed light on the larger issues at play. She was proud of the way she had handled the situation, but more than that, she was determined that the officer's actions not be swept under the rug. She continued to speak out, using her newfound platform to advocate for reform. The public's response to her calm and confident reaction to the officer's bullying had sparked a sense of empowerment in many people. It reminded them that standing up for yourself and asserting your rights didn't require aggression or hostility. It required dignity and courage. The officer, on the other hand, was facing intense backlash. The internal investigation led to his suspension, but many within the community were calling for stronger consequences. Public opinion was divided. Some believed the officer should be reinstated, citing his years of service, while others believed he should be permanently removed from duty for his actions. Regardless, the damage to his reputation was done, and the media's portrayal of the incident ensured that he would forever be associated with his abuse of power. But the woman, now widely respected for her courage, shifted the focus back to the larger picture. She didn't want this to be seen as just an isolated failure of one officer. She wanted it to serve as a wake-up call. She pushed for reforms that went beyond punishment. She advocated for training that emphasized empathy, anti-bias education, and the importance of de-escalation in confrontations. She understood that systemic change wouldn't happen overnight, but that this moment could be the beginning of a much-needed shift in the way authority figures interacted with the public. The community began to come together in support of the woman's calls for change, while some were still reluctant to fully confront the reality of how prejudice could seep into everyday life. Many others began to speak out about their own experiences with unfair treatment and mistreatment by those in power. The incident created a ripple effect that reverberated throughout the city. People began to share their stories, not just about corrupt officers, but about all forms of injustice they had faced, whether in the workplace, the school system, or at the hands of other authority figures. The officer's downfall, while significant, was only one small part of the larger conversation that was beginning to take shape. In local town halls and public forums, citizens began to engage in discussions about how to address issues of racial bias and police brutality. The woman's story, combined with the officer's public humiliation, had forced people to look in the mirror and ask hard questions about how they treated others and whether they were complicit in allowing inequality to thrive. For the woman, the victory wasn't in the officer's punishment. It wasn't even in the attention she received from the media. Her victory was in the change that began to unfold around her. She knew that even if she never spoke publicly again, the momentum had shifted. The moment had sparked a deeper dialogue about respect, equality, and the way people in positions of power should be held accountable. But perhaps the most profound change was within the community itself. As people continued to talk about the incident, the neighborhood began to see each other through a different lens. The woman's actions, her patience, her grace under pressure, and her refusal to back down had inspired a collective sense of responsibility. People started standing up for each other in ways they hadn't before. Neighbors helped each other more. Strangers took the time to engage in meaningful conversations, and a greater sense of solidarity began to emerge. The officer, having faced the consequences of his actions, was left to reflect on how easily he had allowed his biases to take over. He had assumed he could get away with his behavior because of his badge, but the woman's steady confidence had proven otherwise. It was a bitter lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. His career was uncertain, but the larger truth was clear. Abuse of power could never be tolerated, not by law enforcement, not by anyone. And as for the woman, she continued her work, using her voice to drive change. She became an advocate for better policies within the law enforcement system, pushing for accountability, transparency, and reform in the way officers interacted with the public. She knew the work was just beginning, but she was determined to keep going, knowing that her actions had already set the wheels of change in motion. The woman's composure and strength had turned a single act of injustice into a moment of real change. As the story of the confrontation spread and the public reacted, it wasn't just about the consequences the officer faced. It was about the larger lesson that came from it. The importance of standing up against injustice, no matter who you are, and the power of truth in holding people accountable. Her victory wasn't in making the officer apologize. It was in showing that one person's courage could ignite a ripple effect that transformed a whole community. The incident had ignited important conversations about power dynamics, race, and accountability. The woman's stance proved that even those in positions of authority must answer for their actions. The community, once divided, now understood the importance of supporting one another, especially when faced with abuse of power. But change didn't stop with this one incident. The momentum that the woman had started continued to build. People were no longer afraid to challenge unfair authority. They were finding their voices and learning that standing up for what's right wasn't just an option. It was a responsibility. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced injustice or seen someone else face unfair treatment? How did you respond? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Together, we can continue to build a more just and compassionate society. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo and inspire us all to stand up for what is right. Let's keep pushing for change, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more empowering content.